Syria, certainly yet, because Russia came in. If Russia hadn't have gone, Syria would have gone. It hadn't come in, Russia would hadn't come in, Syria would have gone. It was a very interesting development overnight as we're speaking. And that is that Trump's national security advisor, John Bolton, he says he resigned, Trump says he fired him. I'm more inclined to believe Trump on this one. And John Bolton was one of the people involved in the project for the New American Century in September 2000, when they wrote that document listing the regime change countries they wanted and saying we need another Pearl Harbor to justify it. And since then, of course, John Bolton's never seen a country he didn't want to bomb. And he is a very close associate of a man called Sheldon Adelson. Sheldon Adelson is a Las Vegas casino multi-billionaire, an Israeli-American who owns media in Israel, associate of, indeed, beyond, above Benjamin Netanyahu. And he's Trump's biggest funder and the Republican Party's biggest funder.
Gave him millions of dollars.
Oh, yeah. Amazing amount of money. Yeah. Just as George Soros is a major funder of the Democratic Party. Control both sides, you control the game. And so Adelson represents Israel, basically. He said, I quote him in there as saying, the only thing that really matters to me is what's good for Israel. Right? And so he wanted Bolton to be in as national security advisor. And I'm no Trump supporter. I mean, I think that can be fair. I'm a supporter of none of these political parties. They're all a diversion and irrelevance.
Is Trump part of the satanic death cult?
He is a pawn of it, which is different. I mean, I don't know what level it will go, but he's a pawn of it. Now, I'll tell you where I'm going with this. I've said in this book, and I've said in a previous book, my previous book, I think that for all his faults, and he has many, and his narcissism and all the rest of it, Trump genuinely would rather talk than bomb countries. And so what he's done, he's been under tremendous pressure from the ultra-Zionists that ring him, and the Christian Zionists like Pompeo, his Secretary of State, and Mike Pence, his Deputy President, and Bolton. He's not a Christian Zionist, but he is a front for the Israeli extremists. Trump tried to talk to North Korea. Who scuppered that, at least up to now? Pompeo and Bolton. Because the idea, North Korea was on the list, the Project for the New American Century, for regime change. They don't want talk that might come to some agreement and rapport. He talked Trump in his election campaign in terms of wanting to get closer to Russia, because I don't think he genuinely sees the point of antagonism with Russia. So the moment he became elected, this Russia collusion hoax was perpetrated, which lasted years. It's just basically blown out now through lack of evidence. And so in this period, Trump has not got closer to Russia, because if he did, oh, see, proof, he's Putin's puppet. He wanted to pull troops out of Syria, if you remember. Mm-hmm. And then your Boltons and your Pompeos and that ultra-Zionist network were like responding against that. You can't do that, you can't do that. And he actually did an interview, I don't know whether you saw this, on mainstream television, just after he'd announced that he wanted to take troops out of Syria. And he said, I don't know, you want to take troops out of Syria? And everyone's kind of coming in to say, you can't do that, you can't do that. This is the cult. Because they want Assad gone. They don't want troops being pulled out of Syria. And then very recently, in the last few days, he's talked about peace talks with the Taliban in Afghanistan. And of course, that got knocked on the head. He seems to be moving towards maybe face-to-face talks with the leaders of Iran. This is the last thing that your Boltons want and your Netanyahus want. They want war with them. And so it reached a point, I'm not surprised. I've actually been waiting for it. I've been thinking over the last few weeks, how long can Trump take this without reacting against it? And it seems he came out, Trump, overnight and said, I just basically disagreed with so many things that John Bolton wanted me to do, which was actually war, not jaw. And we'll see if Trump is genuine about pushing back on this death cult, as I call it, by who he replaces Bolton with, and whether he does now say, hold on a minute, I'm going to talk to these people, I'm not going to talk the language of war. Because if you remember, only a few weeks ago, Trump, with Bolton at his side, came within minutes of launching a missile attack against Iran. Because that's what the Israel death cult wants, and it's what its representative in government, Bolton, wants and Pompeo wants. And Trump, if you remember, decided at the very last minute he was going to pull back and not do it. And so there's been
this over that drone attack, right?
There's been this
Hormuz, right?
There's been this clear tussle, and where it goes from here, we'll see. But Trump is under tremendous pressure because his basic funding comes from Adelson and those same sources, and he's got an election coming up. So we'll see where it goes from here. But
that's like kind of a chink in the armor. You can see that someone's pushing back against the Illuminati in there.
Because I'll tell you this, I know from my own sources, information, that there are many people within the government of America, within the military and intelligence community of America, who know that what I've just said in this interview is true. They know about the death cult. They know that Mossad and its military, etc., is massively involved in 9/11, and is massively has been dictating the events in the Trump administration, and they are pushing back as best they can against it. And the more the merrier, because we need to bring an end to this, because it's going to take us down a road of a devastating future if we allow these insane people to continue to control events.
What didn't we cover in here? I know I mentioned Osama bin Laden. What else do you think is super relevant that we mention about what you put out in this book? Do we go deep enough into Cheney?
Oh, I go into Cheney.
There's a recent movie about him called Vice that's interesting to watch.
Cheney is a brutal, brutal psychopath, and the evidence I put in the book, because there's a chapter early on in which I look at some of the players. Because you see, Brian, one of the biggest defense systems that what is happening is public incredulity that someone could be that evil. They would never do that. I mean, there was a mainstream journalist who claims to be progressive, I quote him in the book, who said that these conspiracy theories, as they're called, about 9/11 are just nonsense, because George Bush is not that intelligent, not that ballsy, and not that evil. And you sit there and you go, this is a mainstream journalist. And you think that something like 9/11 was orchestrated by Boy George Bush, who said that humans and fish can coexist peacefully, that takes lessons in tying his shoelaces. I mean, what? It's ridiculous. But still, the mainstream mind says Bush was president, therefore he must have been orchestrating it, because he's top of the hierarchy. These are here today, gone tomorrow puppets. It's deep in the shadows that it's orchestrated from. So this incredulity of they would never do that, what they're actually saying is no one would do that. Well, one of the early chapters before I really hit 9/11 looks at the background to Father George Bush, Boy George Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and others. And when you see their background, people will realize they would do that. And let me tell you something else, Brian, just maybe as we come to a close here. Something you say, other relevant things. Here's a relevant thing. I mentioned that there is a common theme of people providing themselves with cover stories until the Pentagon was hit, particularly then, some for later. Well, the head of the acting head, who then became the head shortly afterwards of the uniform level of the military in the Pentagon at the time of 9/11, was a man called General Richard Myers. Richard Myers is a liar about what happened to him on 9/11, and let me explain what I mean by that, and then I'll come to Rumsfeld, brackets, ditto. Myers told in Army radio and other places and sources that on the morning of 9/11, when all the war games are going on, which means the Pentagon will be full of generals running the war games, not Richard Myers, who was acting head of the whole military at that time at uniform level, he was on Capitol Hill having a meeting with a guy called Senator Max Cleland about some hearings coming up. He said that just before he went into the meeting, someone said a plane's hit the World Trade Center. And so he kind of, he hit the World Trade Center. Okay, so what do? You're the head of the military at uniform level. He goes into the meeting with Max Cleland. A second plane hits the World Trade Center. No one tells the acting head at uniform level of the military, he says. He then says he comes out at the end of this meeting, having not been told about the second plane, and as he came out, someone shouted, "The Pentagon's been hit." So all the way through, until the Pentagon's hit, Myers has the cover story. He's at a meeting with Senator Max Cleland on Capitol Hill. I'll come back to him in a second. Donald Rumsfeld's story, told to Larry King on then CNN. I watched it myself at the time, jaw-dropping. He's the defense secretary. He's basically second-in-line commander to the president. He said that at the time that Flight 11 was leaving Boston Logan, he is sitting in his office at the Pentagon, and he's having a breakfast meeting. He then says that someone came in and said to him, a plane's hit the World Trade Center. He said, this was his words, and about 15 minutes later, I felt a jarring thing. That was the Pentagon being hit on exactly the furthest away point from him of the Pentagon. By the way, where the Pentagon is said to have been hit was an area called Wedge 1, which had gone through massive building work to protect that one wedge from an attack like that. Just a coincidence, nothing to worry about. So if you take that Flight 77, the Pentagon was supposed to have been hit, kind of about, 9:38, 9:40. You go back 15 minutes, you're at what, 9:25? He's saying that he's in his office at the Pentagon all the way through this, and only at 9:25 did someone come and say to him that the World Trade Center has been hit by a plane without mentioning the second one. And then, in 2004, Richard Clarke, the Bush administration terrorism advisor, counterterrorism advisor, wrote a book called Against All Enemies. And he described what happened to him that day. He says, as soon as he heard about the first plane, he's into the White House and he set up what he calls a teleconference with the Pentagon. And this was maybe about 9:10, not long after the second plane hit. And they had a teleconference link, and he had a teleconference link with the Federal Aviation Administration, and with the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the Military Command Center at the Pentagon. And they were deciding what's going to happen. This is what? Half an hour before the Pentagon is hit. Who does he describe on the screen at the Pentagon that he's having conversations with in terms of Myers? Colonel Richard Myers, General Richard Myers rather, and Donald Rumsfeld. He wasn't on Capitol Hill at all. He was in the Pentagon. Why wouldn't he be there when there's war games going on? Rumsfeld was not in his office. He was at the command center, involving it. I mean, and Richard Clark describes how he had a conversation with Myers. He says, basically, are any planes up yet? And Myers is going, well, you know, we're going to put some birds up, as he put it, as soon as we can. Well, how about now? So here you have the Defense Secretary, and there's more about this in the book, more detail, the Defense Secretary and the acting head of the military uniform level on 9/11 lying about where they were. But what's the common theme? We were not involved until the Pentagon was hit. Myers, someone said the Pentagon's been hit. Rumsfeld, I felt a jarring thing. Pentagon hit. Because there is no credible explanation except systematic delay and stand down that there were no military aircraft reactions to 9/11 before the whole thing had unfolded. None. So they had to give themselves cover stories. Liars. An absolute disgrace to America, a disgrace to all those people that died, a disgrace to their families, and a disgrace to the mainstream media who could have uncovered this a long time ago. You know that story I've just telling you? That one? That was in Alice in Wonderland and the World Trade Center disaster, which I published in 2002. Media that have covered that story, nil. It's unbelievable. But the idea is to, at a time when you're not supposed to say boo to anything, is to have some of that. Consequences, let me have them, because the truth is coming out and nothing's going to stop it. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about it, Brian, because this is absolutely what needs to happen. People need to hear this stuff.
It's my pleasure. Is there anything we need to say about Osama bin Laden?
Did you know that the Bush family, especially Father George Bush, who was not only a psychopath, he was a pedophile, torturer of children, which I've been writing in my books long, long before he died. You know, someone like that would care about 3,000 dead on 9/11 in New York. Are you kidding? He worked for a company called the Carlyle Group. The Carlyle Group had clients, the bin Laden family. They were very, very close to the bin Laden family, the Bushes. And on the morning of, across the days of 9/11, Bush was reported to be in a Carlyle Group meeting with members of the bin Laden family. You'll remember that after a certain point, commercial aircraft were all grounded. Only military aircraft were allowed to fly.
Yeah.
Late that afternoon of 9/11, when all commercial aircraft were grounded, a 747 left, ironically, Boston Logan Airport with members of the bin Laden family on board to fly back to Saudi Arabia. That same afternoon, when commercial aircraft were grounded, an El Al Israeli airline plane left New York with Israelis on board. Again, Saudi Arabia Sabbatean Frankists. Those that control Israel, Sabbatean Frankists. You see the connection. And like I say, wherever you look, there are unanswered questions and blatant untruths and suppressions of information.
And it's all covered in here.
All covered in here. Ironically, well, ironically, that's not the word, perhaps staggeringly, given that we've had this conversation of some length, it scratched the surface of what's actually in the book. Because not only is there a hell of a lot more to know about 9/11 and the lies and the way it was pulled off, because, you know, we won't go into this now because it's in the book, but an Israeli company, an Israeli-controlled company called P-Tech, out of Quincy, Boston, had complete control of the computer systems of the American military, government, Federal Aviation Administration, NORAD, on 9/11, and were able to, in real time, to change what they were seeing and to block inter-department communications. The company, ICTS, or a subsidiary of ICTS, a security company, which was created by Israeli intelligence agencies and run by Israeli intelligence agencies, had the contract for plane and passenger security at Boston Logan Airport and Newark, New Jersey. Just a coincidence, nothing to worry about.
You keep digging, you just find more stuff. David, what do you want people to do when they read this book? I mean, like, what do you really want people to change about their perception?
The main thing initially is to rewire perception of the world and get rid of they would never do that. Because once you get rid of that and you see that they would do that, then so many other things becomes possible for so many other things that are going on but are far out to actually be accepted as perceptual possibility. But what we need more than anything in the reaction to this book is a demand, not least in America, that these people are brought to account to explain why they did what they did. Why did Michael Chertoff, as head of the criminal division of the Justice Department, let 5 Israelis go who were whooping and high-fiving over 9/11 and filming it, and 200 others in a spy ring in 2001, let them go back to Israel? How can Dominic Suter, who ran Urban Moving Systems, where the 5 dancing Israelis, as they were called, worked, how could he go back into America since and not even be questioned? Because there's a world that people see, and then there's the world that controls what people see. And once you realize that exists, that takes on a totally different perspective. And to understand how that works is to understand daily events, it's to understand where the world is going and the direction it's going, all this AI, all this censorship. And it's to see that what we need to do, please, whether Jewish or Muslim or Hindu or atheist or any of it, whether black and white and whatever, we need to put down the fault lines, because this death cult is dividing and ruling us. One of the reasons it brought Trump to power was to be the symbol of dividing America. That's why he was brought there. One of the reasons he was brought in. We've got to put the fault lines down and realize that if we don't stop fighting among ourselves, this death cult will meet its goal. But if we realize that we're being played off against each other purposely, so we're fighting among each other while the death cult's doing that and not being exposed. A situation where if you expose what's really going on, you're dismissed immediately as a conspiracy theorist. In other words, not to be taken seriously. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. That's not a conspiracy theory book. That's a conspiracy fact book. That's why, you know, it's done at such length. When people say, okay, well, where's your evidence? Well, there you go. Have some of that. Evidence on an incredibly detailed level to prove that it's not a theory at all, it's a fact. And let the 18th anniversary of 9/11 be the day that the house of cards of this death cult started to unravel.
How can they get a copy of this, David?
Get it via davidicke.com. They'll get it within 24 hours.
It's called The Trigger. It is chock full of lots of stuff we didn't get into, lots of detail, as you can expect with the David Icke book, topping out nearly 900 pages. What's next for you?
Well, the next book, which already got on my mind, is it's about taking our power back. Because what this death cult wants us to believe is that we are powerless little me's, and it's the last thing we are. And that's a perception that has to be broken, because we're not powerless little me's. That's just what we are manipulated to believe, so that we will live out lives as powerless little me's for no other reason than that's what we've been manipulated to believe we are. So it will be a book about setting people free from powerless little me, to become the infinite enormity that we really are. And when that happens on any scale, the days of the death cult are over, because its whole foundation is perceptual control of the population, keeping us there. Once you start to do that, whoa, so that's what's going on. And the other thing about knowing who you are, that we are not our name, we are not our race, we are not our sexuality, they're just experiences. We are consciousness, infinite awareness, having an experience. And that consciousness can be as vast as or as tiny as we can be manipulated, or we can be released in terms of the expanded nature to be. And I can tell you that when you step out of the perceptual confines of your name, your race, your sexuality, and you see them as experiences, very transitory, brief experiences for your consciousness, then you step beyond the currency of control, fear, which is why I've written that book in no fear whatsoever of the consequences. And if anyone is to fear the consequences of that book, it's the death cult. Because I'm looking in your eyes, death cult, and I ain't blinking.
David, this has been epic. I really appreciate you coming on. I really appreciate you writing this book. And I appreciate your message, which is that we all need to become aware, get out of what you call the postage stamp mentality.
Yeah.
And it's the third episode you've been here at London Real, and it's always the theme. There is the what, but the why is always the same with you, and I really appreciate that a lot. And
it's a pleasure.
It's
been a real pleasure talking to you.
Always a pleasure.
I always say to people, Brian Rose is the best interviewer I've ever talked to, because he doesn't think it's all about him. He's not a Piers Morgan who will interrupt you halfway through a sentence because it's all about him. You ask relevant questions, you let people answer them, you ask another relevant question. That is the real art of interviewing, and I think you're absolutely superb, and what you're doing here is fantastic.
Thanks, David. I appreciate that. I really want to get the information out to people so they can make their decision. Like, that's what we're trying to do here. So I think that's why the style is appropriate.
Absolutely.
I just want to say to anybody who's watched this, if this has resonated with you, please share it with someone that you think might resonate with them. I'm expecting us not to get any type of love from YouTube. We appreciate YouTube, but they have actually come out and said that anything that even smells like a conspiracy theory, they won't allow it to propagate on their network.
I wonder why.
Yeah, and that's okay, you know, but we have enough people out there that want to hear this message. So if you're enjoying this, share it, let people know about it, so we can get as many people to think about these topics. And until next time, David.
Always a pleasure, mate.
Massive pleasure. All right, thank you, sir.
No problem.